Okay, folks, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Coach Etch Tips today. I'm really excited about our guest here. I first got to know her a number of years ago, working professionally with her. She was assistant principal. And I think it was your first admin job when you came to the middle school. And she has grown exponentially since leaving that job with great experiences, becoming then a middle school principal and now a high school principal, one of the probably most famous high schools, I think, in the state of Minnesota, really, when you look at it. I know my mother's a 55 grad of Washburn, so it is the most famous high school in Minnesota, according to my mother, but they argue Richfield, Washburn, my kids are from Richfield. But Emily, I want to thank you for being on the show today. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say because you've had a very diverse experience, even though you hardly ever left Hennepin County, lived in St. Paul a little bit ago, a U of M grad, numerous degrees, but fill us in on what brought you to education and kind of your background professionally and everything.
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks so much for inviting me, Jeff. This is really fun. Yeah, I am a Minneapolis native, a product of Minneapolis schools K-12 and then U of M. What brought me, it was interesting. I originally was in journalism and then that ended up turning into an English degree. And that led me to teaching high school English and getting into I taught for, I think, 14 years, and getting into administration was really kind of happenstance. So I would say my love of literature, my love of kids, my love and being very social is what got me into teaching. And then I got into administration really because I was the teacher that was always going down to the principal's office saying, hey, we should do this. Hey, we should do that. Oh, this should be the thing. I started chairing committees and doing all these little random leadership things. And then you sort of fall into actually becoming an administrator. So, yeah.
Great. So that just kind of, what was that burning passion, desire to just, is there any, when you got here and you got connected with kids, it's just like those up and down days, just, is there something in there that really kind of be your why? I saw your purpose statement on your webpage.
Right on. So yeah, I think it's evolved a ton, right? Today, I would say my purpose statement is to empower students to create their best future. Back when I first became a teacher in 1993, I thought I was gonna, save the world, right? You have that kind of white folks go save the children thing that comes out of that ignorance of not really understanding the world when you're young. And then you learn being in community with people that it isn't about saving people, right? It's about, creating context for kids within which they can determine where they want to go, right?
Well, it's like one of those things, and I just know that I did a previous interview with somebody that used to be an avid director in his district down in El Paso, Texas, and he's, that picture, the kids don't know what they don't know, and until you can paint that picture to what that best future can be for them, it's hard for them to really know where they can go. And I know you said you started out as a classroom teacher, and what were some of the things, we'll kind of move into admin stuff, but as a teacher that you did to connect? Because I think that's one, like you say, I mean, one of the first things I'd ever say about you in meeting you is that social. You're a very outgoing person, an easy person to get to know, to meet. And I'm sure with kids, that probably appealed to them right away. And sometimes people are just natural relationships, but sometimes people aren't. And what were things you did intentionally that you maybe learned from the seat of your pants as time went on that made you connect and really help those kids grow and start looking to be the best version of themselves that they could be?
Right on. I do think so much of it is gut level at first, right? You have no clue what you're doing when you're a new teacher. I think the big advantage I had as a young teacher was really believing in every single kid. And, as I've learned more and more about systemic racism over the years and the ways that we get in kids' way, I think I was lucky in that my orientation to kids was very much like, nope, you're going to do this. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And kids respond to that. I would always say that these days there is no positional authority. There is only earned authority. Kids, when they see that you're completely committed to their success, that's when kids will buy in, right? And so, and you mentioned painting a vision of a potential future. I think the other thing is we often, again, get in the way of kids really dreaming for themselves. There are so many barriers that get in kids' way. And I think for years we've sort of said, oh, American dream, just work hard and you can be anything. And kids just look around their worlds and are like, that's so not really true. But when you can get real about, oh, hey, yep, that barrier's there. Nope, that's true. That's real. And let's talk about how to jump it, how to move it, how to get past it. But being honest with kids about, the true state of the world rather than, painting this sort of hypothetical. That's been a big learning for me. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't probably see it in social media. One of my big hashtags always is dreams, passion, purpose. And I think that's a big thing to sometimes, because sometimes kids are just so beat down, especially, in the type of communities and schools that you've taught in, you get a lot of kids that really haven't had a chance to dream. They're just kind of in survival mode each day. And to take them to that next step. One of the things now as you moved into administration, I've always thought is unique about you. You've worked in diverse communities, and I always thought one thing you really did is you got to connect, especially with the boys in the middle school. I haven't seen you so much since you left there, but to relate, but being, a white female and basically working in this schools that you're the minority, and then you have to be the woman in charge too, and kind of just your mindset. And I know how important equity is to you, and your family reflects kind of where you've worked and stuff too. That how have you approached that? I mean, is it something that you were intentional early on in your career? Is it something that's kind of evolved as time's gone on and you get more and more of an understanding? Because I think not just the culture you create in your building in your classroom is important, but the culture that you're involved in. You're involved with a lot of different cultures and been through a lot of different change, and how you've handled that, because not many people have experienced that much of it.
Yeah, so I had the advantage of growing up in Minneapolis, where I did go to racially diverse schools back in the 70s and 80s. And my family has, as you mentioned, become racially diverse, if you use that term, as well. My kids are not white. My brother's kids are not white. And so, certainly when you start to look at the world through your own kids' eyes, you start to see things a little differently, right? But I think that it's sort of where I come from, I would say that. And I early on sort of figured out that an ideal mix in a school is when there's no racial group over 50% or ideally over 40%. So you have all different groups of kids and everyone sort of sees themselves in a significant number, right? But there's no one dominant race in the school, where that school sort of seems like it's a black school or a white school or whatever. I think that's really healthy for kids. And so that's definitely led me to have more of a lens toward how do we create healthy integration in schools? Obviously, when we did it back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, America did it really poorly, and it was really unhealthy for kids of color. And so now when we look at it, we have to look at it differently, obviously. But I think it comes from a combination of life experience and some coincidences, they're sort of where I landed in different schools over the years, right? Like sometimes, the randomness of coming to Richfield, right? That was the first job I applied for outside of Minneapolis, because Minneapolis was closing schools that year and there were no AP positions. And so I thought, all right, well, I'll go next door, and I got the job. And, that thing, then you fall into a whole bunch of new learnings, right? Being in a new context.
Yeah, you do. Now, we talk a little bit about, you moved from a position of being a teacher and related there into a position of leadership as admin and stuff. And how is it when you changed, tried to create relationships? Because when you're the teacher, you're in the classroom and you have that 20 to 35 kids that are in your classroom, every hour, where other than when you're dealing with discipline, you really would like to get to know the kids in a positive light. And I just kind of knowing your personality, I saw how visible you were when I worked with you, and just seeing kids, how do you go create those relationships with kids as being sometimes having to be the hammer, but also have to be able to put your arm around them and say, hey, I love you and I'm pulling for you, even though I'm being tough on you. How do you balance that? And how do you create those relationships with the kids when you're not in the classroom with them?
Well, it's very different as an assistant principal and as a principal.
Yeah.
So like Richfield as assistant principal, doing discipline is actually a great way to really connect and build relationships with students, right? Because you get to be their advocate for how to make things better. And I, for example, if a kid and a teacher are knocking heads, and I can create the context where those two can talk with each other, with me at the table, and the kid really feels heard and the teacher feels heard, and then that, improves that situation. Now the kid feels like, okay, you've got my back, right? As an assistant principal, you get to do that all the time. And then of course, at Richfield, I had the sixth grade. So then I knew those kids, right? The 6 years I ended up knowing, I felt like I knew a lot of kids. I don't have that luxury as a principal. It's really disconnected, and particularly in a building with almost 1,700 kids.
Yeah.
So and honestly, my orientation to it is that what I owe kids mostly is to give them the best possible teachers I can. In the end, what matters in education is what happens between the teacher and the student. That's where the magic happens, right? The rest of us are auxiliary to that. And that is something that I will say really bluntly and blatantly to folks that work with me. If you're a classroom teacher, you're a classroom teacher. And if you're not, you're other. You're the rest of us, right? We're just here to support. And so in that vein, my greatest energy as a principal really goes toward the faculty and make it so my relationships with my faculty are what I really focus on. It's just like a teacher has with their class, you know? So I have to know my teachers, get in the classroom, make sure folks know that I know their practice, right? So I can be of greatest support. So then teachers are at their best, and that's what matters to kids, right? So I think, and again, particularly in the large schools, you know, I don't really buy into the sort of cult of personality where the principal has to be everywhere and everybody's looking at the principal.
Wow.
I don't buy that. I think being available to kids is really important. When kids want something, making sure I'm there to listen and help them get it. But in terms of running around the building trying to know almost 1,700 kids, that just doesn't really happen, and it sucks. I mean, just to be really honest about it, it is somebody who had been in the classroom and you have
Yeah.
those relationships. But you know, what I know to be true is that what matters to kids is the quality of their teachers. So that's really the focus that I put into it as a principal.
I've seen some of your pictures on social media at school and stuff, and it seems like the kids do still have a pretty good time with you at times. And I think that's great that you get out there and are with them doing that, because that's kind of meeting them where they're at, because that's their life nowadays. And I think that's a great thing.
Well, I mean, yeah, you take a pie and a face for charity, would let kids do stuff like that, right? Absolutely, being present 100%. And this year with COVID, I've had more kids emailing me, you know, because we're not in the building and kids don't necessarily know who to ask for something. And so they just come straight to me, and it's great. And for super random stuff, and it's wonderful. And I like being that sort of, yeah, you know, you can ask me when you're not sure who else to ask, you know.
Well, one thing, Ken, you talk about your staff relationships, and I think going both ways and having discussions, as I told you, I've taught more on the teacher-student relationship and kind of mindfulness for teachers to survive the profession. And, you know, testing is a huge pressure on everybody, whether you're a teacher, admin, parents, kids, everybody. But probably the next thing that impacts teachers most is that admin relationship, because it's when you have a boss you're working for, it can be a lot better. When you have one that's not, it can put a lot of stress on your job. I mean, I've been very blessed. I mean, I spent my 32 years in Richfield, and I really think I had great principals to work with. And assistant principals and always relationship-driven people. And one of the things that I know we didn't maybe always agree, but you're always very approachable. And I think that's a big thing, that people have to be approachable. And then also, it's got to go both ways. People got to know who the boss is and who the leader is too. And you said, you know, leadership is earned and it's not just dictated. And I think those are the people in leadership that eventually end up not making it. And I think that's probably why you have succeeded, because people that observe you and take the next step is that you are approachable and create those relationships with teachers and help them grow. And if you could talk a little bit about that, if there's an assistant principal or principal watching this, and maybe even so teachers get a little bit of better understanding of that role. I think over time, I understood it better, but I'll guarantee you my first few years in teaching, I did not. I had the athletic directors.
Right.
Secretary one day came storming through, and you know, when I get into something, I can get into it pretty strong. Finally one day she says, "Jeff, stop!" And she was like a second mom to me, and I'm like, "What? You don't have to be right all the time. You're such a blank sometimes." And I'm just like, "Whoa!" And most other people, I would have just been, "What do you mean?" We had that relationship, and she could do that to me.
Yeah.
So kind of the balancing act of teachers understanding it, but to help people in leadership to deal with that too, because that just, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years we worked together. That's one thing I always knew. I could come talk to you. Even when it was with Stephen or Brian there, I could come talk to them, so they're approachable. I didn't always get in my way, but they're approachable and we could talk. And I think as a teacher, that's important to have, you know, leadership people that are like that. So if you talk about that a little bit, appreciate it.
Sure. No, there's two pieces that you really bring up there. One is, and people hear me say this all the time, more heads are better than one. I love talking things through. I love throwing ideas out on the table and say, what about this? What about that? With a complete confidence that the more people that are at the table, the better the outcome is going to be. Not everybody loves that generative process, and you have to be sensitive to people. That can be a little unnerving sometimes when you're not nailing something down. You're just sort of batting ideas around. But I think that's part of listening. And the other piece of it is checking the ego and making sure that when somebody comes down and says, hey, I really don't like this thing that you guys are wanting to do, and they want to talk about it, to be able to do that. And with a truly open mind, and so I've always taken the attitude, like, if I can't convince you that something is right, then maybe it's not right, and I better listen harder. So being open to that, so you don't feel defensive when a teacher comes and says, we don't want to do that, that's terrible. You got to be able to go, okay, let me hear you, without feeling like, oh no. So that's a piece that gets built with time, obviously, right? I think one big mistake I made as a brand new AP was feeling like I had to sort of prove myself all the time and be all extra competent. And that is just irritating to people. And I can remember my principal saying to me, stop trying to prove you're competent. Everyone knows you're competent. Like, it's not, just settle down, And so I think then being more of service rather than of talent, if that makes sense.
I don't think so, but in your first 2-3 years, I could see that growth moving that way, working with you, which I think is good. And I think that's why you've had the successes and moved up the way you have. So go ahead, continue on what you want to say. I appreciate hearing that.
I think, it just collaboration's everything. I mean, the principal's biggest job is to have a meaningful vision, but it also has to really be a shared vision, right? You can't come in and go, here's where we're going to go, right? You come in, you get to know your community, you say, all right, here's what I think I hear the community saying about where we want to go, right? And then articulate that out as a vision. And then how do we get to that vision? What do those steps look like? And again, supporting people to do that. It's not dictating, and I think that if when we respect kids the same way we respect adults, we get much better results, right? Kids, especially at high school, kids feel it when they're not being treated with full respect. It's like, give me a chance to have some meaningful input.
It's a common thread I heard from a lot of people. Kids want to be seen and they want their voices to be heard. And once we give them the chance to do that, you've got a chance to create a relationship and to help them grow.
And more than that, there's also the belief that kids might actually have some good clue what's good for them. Because we spend so much time saying, we know what's good for you. Well, guess what? The world has been changing so incredibly fast, right? And, since 2007 in particular, with, technology just taking over everything, that it is not reasonable for me to look at whether it's my 18-year-old daughter or any kid in my school and say, I know what's best for you. It's no longer a reasonable proposition. So it has to be, what do you think is best for you? Help me understand that. And let's unpack that a little bit, right? Is that really a good idea? In what way is that a good idea? And so I think when we get over ourselves and this notion that we know best because we're old, right? All right, I'm over 50, I know a lot of stuff, but does that mean that I really truly know what the world's going to be like for these students in 20 years? Like, stop it, right? You don't. And so
look at what it was like 20 years ago compared to now.
Exactly. I mean, you think about it, I started teaching in 1993, no computer, no outside phone, chalkboard, right? Got a whiteboard in the 90s. Whee, that was super exciting. Got a computer in the 90s. It didn't have internet. It was just a computer that we used for the yearbook to actually do some layout and stuff. And so you look at that, compared to the world our kids are in now, right? It's just a completely different context. And as the context changes, so also the kids change. So also our practice has to change. So being a continuous learner as a teacher and as a leader takes on a whole new meaning in today's world, right? Continuous learner, like there's, it's just all bets are off, right?
Yeah, I love that shared vision, bringing people together, because it's you create that culture, and also stuff becomes a lot more powerful. And when you can tell you and the staff are going, and I know just having been not quite the same, but being a head coach, being an assistant coach in sports that I've coached and stuff, all of a sudden you're all on the same page together rather than somebody just telling everybody what to do. It just doesn't, it's not as fulfilling and it isn't as successful.
Right.
Now, with that in mind, I know you went to your first principal's job and then to your second principal's job. What was there that maybe you learned from that first job, stepping in, starting and building that culture that really helped you grow to be more effective when you went into the next job? That you some key things, as somebody's taking over position leader, what are some important things, some steps you took to create that type of culture and that relationship with your staff, with your kids in your building that you put in place in that first year or second year?
I think one of the biggest, most important learnings as the leader of anything is you cannot please everyone. It's not a thing. And the more time you spend trying, then you're wasting energy. And so being willing for people to, and we sort of joke about this as principals, right? So like, if no one's upset at you at any given time, you're probably not accomplishing much, right? So to be real, because what happens is whatever great thing is happening is going to disenfranchise somebody who had it good in the prior realm, right? And so as we move forward, you can move the work forward and believe in the work, and then also have a sensitivity to whose job got harder in that new vision, or who just doesn't love this direction because they just don't, and allow for that without taking it personally or without slowing down, right? Particularly, you mentioned our racial equity work. One of the big problems we have with racial equity work is we try, and we being globally, the global we, try to go at the pace people are ready for stuff, right?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of white folks are never really going to be ready to give up power, right? I mean, because that is the dynamic we're talking about. It isn't. It's not neutral. It's an active stepping away from the use of privilege, and so people aren't really going to be ready. And I think there's a pace piece that we have to be sensitive to, like, okay, we're going to make these moves, we're going to do these things, and I'm going to have a few people that don't like it. And that has to be okay. And you just take care of those people and love them and try to take care of their needs, but don't stop the work.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important. So I think that's probably the number one thing really, is when you're doing significant work, it's not going to be universally cheered, period.
So give me an example. That first day you walked into a staff meeting when you became principal at Washburn, what did you say to the staff? How did you open things up and just say, okay, here? And I don't know if you knew many of them before, but you said, hey, I'm Emily. I'm here to work with you. How did you start that out?
Yeah. It's funny because when you said first, I was thinking when I went to Sanford, that was entertaining because I did know a couple people. And they kind of called it out right away in the first staff meeting. And Washburn, that was actually part of how I landed at Washburn, were some teacher colleagues that I had taught with at another school who had kind of come to me and said, hey, you should come be principal at Washburn. You'd love it. It's a great school, So how does that open up? I think an important piece is to let people get to know me, right? So there has to be a little bit of vulnerability. I put up a picture of myself in 8th grade, a picture of myself graduating from high school, like things like that, the braces and stuff. My family, just sort of try to be real and be willing to put yourself out there. As social as I am, that does not come naturally. I come from a very Scandinavian background of you don't put yourself out there, right? So you have to sort of override that to like, no, people need to know me. Let me give you something to know. Also, my values, right? I think it's really important. Washburn is an international baccalaureate school. That's something that I highly value. Talk about why, talk about what that means. What does that look like as a whole school piece, and things like that. Racial equity as well. I mean, people know that, I have that background. I mean, my doctoral dissertation was literally about teachers doing racial justice professional development and what the outcomes were. And so having that background, people know I have that background. But I think coming into it from a place of respect too, right? It's not just, here we go. And particularly you look at schools where equity work has gone badly, where a leader sort of takes like, we're going to do it this way. And if you don't like it, you're racist. And so, it's like, then people get really injured along the way, right? And that's, that definitely doesn't move the work forward. So there is definitely a piece of unpacking things together, learning together, not, so it isn't just like, here's what I think, but that commitment to the work, being transparent, I think about that. being transparent about my values so that people could know.
Well, that's good. One thing I think people have gotten to know you, always know where you stand. And I think in the leadership role, that's an important thing. And the other thing is that I think it's been cool for people is that people do get to know you. And I think sometimes people in their leadership positions kind of having that, I don't want to call it vulnerability and stuff to be able to say, okay, you can get to know me. And just because of my actions, I'll lead you, I'll become your leader, but I'm not going to dictate to you that I'm your leader. And some people are afraid to get to know their staffs or to get to know people, but relationships is such a big part if it working well. If you want to keep your staff around and not burn out, they have good relationships with the persons they're working with and for. And I think in our years we worked together, our staff had a lot of fun.
For sure.
Not maybe everybody was happy, but I mean, we had fun, but we worked hard too.
And I think one of the big things for a leader is, can your people be vulnerable with you?
Yeah.
Right? I don't want my folks that I work with to feel like they can't be their whole selves. Right? And so how does that look like? How do I create that context? One thing I learned from equity leadership is the leader has to be able to model vulnerability and say, I don't know all the answers, right? I was not a perfect teacher when I was a teacher. My outcomes were racially disparate, just like everybody's, right? And so what does that look like to create that sort of safe space for people to be authentic, to be themselves? And that's absolutely where relationships come in.
Well, that's great because I mean, when you model it, all of a sudden you got a chance to get it in return. And great things happen, like you said earlier, when the real magic happens, when those teachers are happy and they're being supported, and then that connection with them and students in the classroom really goes.
And it's been kind of double that this past year with COVID, right? So you think back to March a year ago. I mean, it's just been a year since the governor's order closed the schools, right? And then, so we closed the schools, didn't really know what was going on. And then we get ready to do full distance learning. Yeah. And I said to my staff, we are all first year teachers right now. We don't know what we're doing. None of us has ever done this before. But I will remind you that some of us were pretty darn good first year teachers, right? I think I didn't have a clue what I was doing my whole first year of teaching, but looking back on it, I think I did okay, right? So we talked about that. So what does it mean for some of us who've been around 20 plus years to be able to have that level of vulnerability of, I've never done this before. I mean, we had, there were some that were like, oh wait, Google Classroom, what? And we did it. And then of course, George Floyd was murdered and everything just, sort of blew up in those last couple of weeks of school. We're just trying to keep kids, with us. And then we had summer and then we regrouped and we said, okay, now we're going to do real distance learning, right? Now we've had a little more time to have a little bit more of a clue, but we're still all first year teachers. Like that was more like student teaching, really. Now, so we talked about again, okay, this is still a new thing. We're going back to actually grading kids, even though we're fully in distance learning. We're still first year teachers. We've not done this before at this level, but that's okay. We can do it, right? And we did it. And now we're finishing Q3 and we're getting ready in Minneapolis to go secondary, going back in person for the first time. And guess what? Here we go. We're first year teachers again. We've got new technology for teachers to be able to teach the in-person kids and the home kids at the same time, right? So it's like deja vu all over again. This is our third iteration of all being first year teachers all together. And so to be able to name that and to be able to say, it's okay that, I don't know how to do this any better than you do, and we're going to figure it out as we go. And kids are still going to learn stuff, right? Kids are still learning and it's okay. And so I think the way that we can talk about stuff like that, right? That's, we're just going to figure it out.
Well, that's great because it's just the type of thing that can make the workplace work good, because the comment thread I heard, I'm not perfect. And I don't know how you guys, I've done some virtual subbing for a teacher that had a baby late. So I came in for 3 weeks and taught social studies, and that a new experience. I mean, to literally reinvent education. You always had a past to go back and reflect on and try and grow from that. This is like, there's nothing, baby. We're figuring it out on the fly right now. We're going to make mistakes sometimes, but we'll keep trying to get better. And it's been unbelievable what you all that are currently full-time in education have done. That's awesome. And I hope and pray that in the next 6 to 12 months, we get back to a semblance where we are back to what our past used to look like, and we learn what we learned out of this and grow with it. But
Mhm.
kind of in wrapping up here, we talked a little bit before we started here, just finding new teachers to come into this career as educators, and keeping the ones that are here and feeling good about what they're doing. And teacher burnout is an issue that gets talked about a lot. And what are some things, just in closing, that you can say to help, why somebody should become a teacher, when they go through those rough days, what can help you get through? Just some pointers from your experience. Like you said, the 20 plus years, and I know you don't have a lot of years left in this profession, but in the next 5 to 10 years, if some things don't change, there's going to be serious shortage of teachers.
No, I think the number one thing I would say is that it is just the most meaningful work that there is. And particularly this past year with the pandemic and then the uprisings, being in education gave me a firm footing from which to approach both of those to help people, right? And I remember particularly early in the pandemic, friends in corporate saying, like, gosh, what do I do to help people? I know all these people are losing their jobs and all these people are suffering. And me thinking, like, I'm so grateful that my professional role is also a role through which I can be of service. And then that happened all over again with the uprisings after George Floyd's murder. And again, being able to look at, okay, I actually have, through my professional role, an ability to make a difference in the community. What does that look like? And so for anyone who's thinking about teaching, like, that's the thing. And I think, interestingly, that's the truth about why teaching has never been particularly well paid, because the folks that are attracted to it aren't, in it for that. And it's always been a question of, like, of course we want to pay more. Taxpayers don't want to pay more. I wish they did. But also that notion of, I could leave with my skills as a high school principal. I could leave education and go corporate and make 3 times as much money tomorrow.
Sure. Yeah.
And I would not love my life.
Yeah.
Right. I love my life. And so I think that's the bottom line for education, is that, sure, it's hard. Of course it's hard, right? Because you're trying to create, realities for kids. But at the same time, it's the best work there is the best work there is. And so anybody coming into education is going to find that you get to empower kids. What else do you want to do in the world?
You changed lives and impact them. I feel so fortunate at my age of 62 now, and talking to some friends getting around retirement. I mean, I loved my job. I loved it, and I felt great about it when I got done. And I talked to some people, and they're like, oh, geez, I got plenty of money, but was it really all worth it? What am I going to do now?
Right.
And I want to go have some fun in life, but it's kind of why I started this whole channel up and things, still kind of to give back and make a difference, because I'm going to have to do something like that to serve and help the rest of my life, because I can't just get up in the morning and go play golf every day and go sit at the beach or by my pool every afternoon. Now, in January, when it's 20 below, the next couple of winters, that will be nice.
But the difference between golfing and coaching golf,
yeah.
that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah,
that's a whole different deal.
But I appreciate how you laid that out. That was awesome, Emily. And I'm looking forward to people, whether they're teachers, aspiring teachers, leaders, administrators. What you had to say from the heart today was awesome. And it's kind of my goal with this whole thing, is just to find a message that connects with one person, that it helps them become a little better at what they do, to make more of a difference for that student in the classroom. So I want to thank you being on here today, and wish you the best going back here in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be awesome. And look forward to seeing you down the road here. And folks, thanks for tuning in. If you had some great thoughts or ideas or questions, put them in the discussion here. Appreciate you coming on to Coach Etch Tips, and we'll see you on the next episode.